Hello everyone, I'm Crime Whisper. I know many of you love listening to these stories as you unwind or drift off to sleep. So, before you do, I'd love for you to drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's chilling case. On the morning of July 1st, 1991, a frantic 911 call shattered the calm in Portland. The caller, Mark Kennedy, was both the apartment manager and roommate of J. Andrew Rickle, a 40-year-old man, concerned after Jay failed to follow his usual morning routine. Mark decided to break into his room to check on him, and what he saw would haunt him forever. Jay lay motionless on his bed, a deep wound slashed across his neck. The body was already cold, showing that he had been dead for hours. Without hesitation, Kennedy called the police. Recognizing the seriousness of the crime, Portland detectives rushed to the scene. The victim's apartment was modest, located on the ground floor of the building. Jay suffered from cerebral palsy and quadriplegia, meaning he was completely dependent on his wheelchair for mobility. His wheelchair stood untouched in the corner, but its owner would never use it again. The cut on Jay's neck had severed his carotid artery, showing the killer struck with brutal precision. The medical examiner confirmed that Jay had been attacked with a sharp weapon, likely a knife, while lying in bed. There were no signs of resistance, possibly because the attack was sudden, or because his disability left him defenseless. The room itself was orderly. Nothing appeared stolen or ransacked. According to neighbors, Jay was known as a kind, spiritual man, a New Age believer who trusted people easily. He often invited strangers into his home to discuss spiritual ideas, sometimes even helping them financially. This trust made detectives consider a grim possibility had Jay unknowingly welcomed his killer inside. But despite extensive efforts, the investigation went nowhere. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, and no murder weapon. The case went cold, an unsolved mystery that lingered for over a year. Then, on July 20th, 1992, another horrifying discovery shocked Portland once again. Two fathers, one visiting his 29-year-old son, Todd Rudiger, the other checking on his 18-year-old daughter, Donna Ferguson, arrived at the young couple's mobile home. What they found would scar them for life. Both Todd and Donna were dead. Their throats had been slashed, echoing the earlier murder of Jay Rick, but this time, the violence was even more horrific. Donna had been bound, tortured, and sexually assaulted before being killed. The crime scene was gruesome. Todd's body was found near the entrance, suggesting he had tried to confront the attacker first. Donna's body was in the back bedroom, her hands tightly bound with rope. The room showed signs of a struggle, but nothing was stolen, meaning the killer's motive wasn't robbery, but something far darker. The killer had moved with strength, confidence, and precision. Investigators concluded they were dealing with a sadistic and organized serial killer, someone who struck quickly, left no trace, and disappeared without a sound. And just like before, the case stalled. There were no witnesses, no weapon, no clear leads. Only one small piece of biological evidence was recovered from the Cynthia's body, had given investigators one last clue, a faint glimmer of hope. But in 1992, DNA analysis was still in its early stages. The technology was far too limited to extract any meaningful information, and what could have been a breakthrough. Piece of evidence sat uselessly in storage after witnessing to such horrifying murders. Portland police began to face a grim reality. A serial killer might be lurking in their city, a predator who hunted in the dark and vanished without a trace. Yet, identifying this monster seemed impossible. Then, in the mid-1990s, science caught up. Forensic technology began to evolve rapidly, and DNA analysis was no longer a futuristic concept, but a revolutionary new weapon in the hands of investigators. Recognizing this, the Oregon Crime Lab decided to test the biological evidence collected from Donna. Ferguson's body against their growing DNA databases. The results shocked everyone. The killer's DNA was a perfect match with a sample taken from a 1995 sexual assault case, 3 years after the double homicide. The 1995 victim was Amanda Kopova, an 18-year-old who had endured a terrifying home invasion. One night, near a Safeway supermarket in Portland, a stranger had broken into her apartment and attacked her viciously. Amanda fought back with all her strength, managing to wound her attacker and forcing him to flee before he could kill her. Amanda later described her assailant as a man under 30, around 5 feet 7 inches tall, with slightly dark skin and distinct Asian features. Fortunately, police had collected biological evidence from the scene and stored it carefully. Years later, when DNA testing became more advanced, the comparison revealed something chilling. The DNA from Amanda's attacker matched perfectly with the DNA from Donna Ferguson's body. For the first time in years, science had drawn a clear line connecting the unsolved 1992 double murder to a 1995 sexual assault. The puzzle pieces finally fit together, revealing that the same predator was behind both crimes. Detectives were thrilled to have their first real lead, but that excitement was tempered by fear. This meant the killer had remained free and active, hiding in plain sight for years. Now, investigators had a DNA profile, but no name to attach to it. In the 1990s, DNA databases were still small and incomplete, and this evidence alone couldn't identify the suspect. So, detectives had to fall back on old-school police work, compiling lists of men aged 20 to 30, with records of violence or sexual assault, who lived in or around Portland during those years. To manage the investigation, Portland PD created a special task force, led by 2 of their best detectives, Michael and John. Their mission, to dig through every file, every arrest record, every suspicious name from 1990 to 1995, and test one DNA sample at a time. Weeks into the search, one name began to stand out: Sebastian Shaw, also known by his Vietnamese name, Chow Quang Ho. He wasn't just another name on the list. Shaw's history was riddled with disturbing coincidences. The first red flag came from an arrest in 1994, a year before Amanda's attack. Shaw had been caught sleeping inside a stolen 1978 Pontiac Bonneville, which had been reported stolen from California. Police charged him with auto theft and illegal possession of firearms. But what truly alarmed detectives wasn't the stolen car. It was what they found. Inside, in the trunk, lay a terrifying arsenal: handguns, rifles, hunting knives, duct tape, surgical gloves, rope, plastic bags, and even a ski mask. These weren't random items. This was a murder kit, assembled with chilling precision. Everything about it suggested premeditation, planning, and a deeply violent mind. The discovery made even veteran officers uneasy. It was as if Shaw had prepared for a night of terror, but hadn't yet chosen his victims. To make matters worse, the timing of this arrest in May 1994 coincided almost exactly with another brutal case in California: the unsolved murder of 14-year-old Jenny Lynn in Castro Valley. Shaw had been identified as a prime suspect in that case, though there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. The timing, the travel route, the stolen vehicle, everything aligned too neatly to ignore. But due to jurisdictional complications, lack of direct evidence, and California's refusal to extradite him for what they considered a minor car theft, Shaw was released after only 2 weeks in custody. What investigators didn't yet know was that they had just let a serial predator walk free. And the second detail that placed Shaw squarely in their sights was even more unnerving: a disturbing pattern linking his home address, workplace, and the locations of the unsolved murders that had terrorized Portland. Detectives Michael and John dug deeper into Sebastian Shaw's background, and what they uncovered painted the picture of a man both cunning and dangerously unpredictable. At first glance, Shaw seemed ordinary. Born in Vietnam in 1967, he had immigrated to the United States with his family when he was young. On paper, he worked a series of low-skilled jobs, janitorial work, restaurant shifts, short-term labor gigs, nothing that stood out. But as investigators traced his movements, they noticed something chilling. Shaw's residences and workplaces formed a disturbing map, one that overlapped almost perfectly with the locations of unsolved violent crimes across Portland. Each area he lived in seemed to have its own set of unresolved assaults, disappearances, or murders. Wherever Shaw went, violence followed, even more suspiciously. He often moved shortly after each major crime, as if he was always one step ahead of police. Detectives began to see a clear behavioral pattern. He would establish himself in a neighborhood, blend in quietly, and then vanish without warning after a crime occurred. Through interviews, police learned that Shaw was known to be quiet, withdrawn, and almost emotionless. Co-workers described him as someone who rarely spoke and often stared into space for long stretches. Others said he showed strange interest in knives and weapons, frequently talking about how easy it was to hurt someone if you knew where to strike. Investigators also discovered that Shaw had a criminal record longer than they expected. In addition to his 1994 car theft, he had been questioned multiple times for peeping, stalking, and assault, but due to lack of evidence, he always managed to slip away. Michael and John began to suspect that Shaw wasn't just a random criminal. He was a highly organized predator who meticulously planned his crimes and left almost nothing behind. In late 1997, the detectives decided to bring Shaw in for questioning. At the time, he was already incarcerated on unrelated charges. Detectives seized the opportunity to obtain a court order for his DNA sample, hoping this would finally connect him to the previous murders. When the Oregon Crime Lab ran the comparison, the results were undeniable. Shaw's DNA was a perfect match to the biological samples recovered from both Donna Ferguson's body and Amanda Kapova's assault. After years of frustration, the investigation had finally found its man. But the revelations didn't stop there. Once Shaw's DNA was officially linked to those cases, law enforcement from neighboring states began comparing their own unsolved files. Shockingly, California authorities found strong circumstantial ties between Shaw and the 1994 murder of Jenny Lynn, the 14-year-old girl killed in Castro Valley. While the DNA evidence there was too degraded for a conclusive match, the timeline, weapons cache, and behavioral profile all pointed directly to Shaw. Confronted with the evidence, Shaw initially denied everything. He claimed he'd never met Donna or Amanda and accused police of framing him. But under prolonged interrogation, cracks began to appear in his story. He grew agitated, shifting between calm, silence, and sudden anger. Then, in a chilling twist, Shaw began boasting instead of denying. He told detectives that he had done things no one could imagine, and that there were many more bodies they would never find. He even referred to himself as a hunter, saying he selected victims who were easy to control. His words made detectives' blood run cold. While Shaw never revealed the full extent of his crimes, his confession was enough to confirm what investigators had long suspected. They were dealing with a serial killer who had been active for years, across multiple states. In 1998, Sebastian Shaw was officially charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder: the 1991 killing of J. Andrew Rip, and the 1992 double murder of Todd Rudiger and Donna Ferguson. During trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming DNA evidence, witness testimony, and his own incriminating statements. Shaw showed no emotion throughout the proceedings. He sat still, eyes blank, as survivors and victims' families described the devastation he had caused. After months of hearings, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Shaw was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. Even behind bars, he continued to show no remorse. In a later interview, he claimed that killing made him feel powerful, and that he saw his victims as practice for the real hunt. His words sent a chill through the nation. To this day, authorities believe that Sebastian Shaw's true victim count could be far higher than what was proven in court. He hinted at multiple other murders, possibly stretching across Oregon, California, and Nevada, but never provided details. Despite extensive efforts to verify his claims, many of those potential cases remain unsolved. Shaw died in prison in 2021, still refusing to admit the full extent of his crimes, taking many of his darkest secrets to the grave. But his name remains a haunting reminder in Oregon's criminal history, a symbol of how trust, science, and persistence can eventually pierce through even the darkest mysteries. Even after Sebastian Shaw's conviction, the story didn't end. In fact, for detectives Michael and John, the end of the trial only deepened the mystery. With Shaw behind bars, they could finally breathe, but the case files sitting on their desks told a different story. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many unsolved murders, too many similarities to ignore. In the months following Shaw's sentencing, the Oregon Crime Lab continued to cross-check his DNA profile against samples from unsolved cases across the Pacific Northwest. What they found was both fascinating and terrifying. In at least 6 other homicide cases, the victims shared nearly identical injuries, deep throat wounds, sexual assault, and signs of binding or restraint. The crimes had occurred between 1988 and 1995. All within a 200-mile radius of Portland. Each case had gone cold years earlier. Now, detectives faced a chilling question. Had Shaw been killing long before his known victims? To trace his path, investigators reconstructed Shaw's timeline. Born Chow Quang Ho in Vietnam, he had moved to the United States in 1974 as a refugee after the war. His early life was troubled. Frequent run-ins with police, reports of animal cruelty, and growing fascination with death. By his teenage years, he was already displaying what psychologists later identified as psychopathic traits: lack of empathy, manipulative charm, and obsessive control. After dropping out of high school, Shaw began drifting between states: Washington, California, Oregon, working low-wage jobs and living in short-term rentals or motels. He often disappeared for months at a time. No one ever asked questions, but his movements matched with multiple unsolved disappearances of women and young girls. During those years, even more disturbing, police found journals and sketches in his former residence, drawings of women bound and gagged, alongside notes like "They don't scream if you know where to cut." The writing was calm, precise, methodical. These weren't the words of a man acting on impulse. They were the thoughts of someone who planned every detail. One entry, dated May 1994, read, "California is good. People leave windows open. Nobody watches." The girl was quiet. The knife was sharp. That same month, Jenny Lynn was murdered in Castro Valley. While this alone wasn't enough to convict him of that particular crime, it added a chilling layer to his psychological profile. Detectives also interviewed Shaw's acquaintances from the early 90s. A former roommate recalled him as obsessed with control and silence. Another woman, who briefly dated him, said he used to talk about purifying people through fear. One officer described Shaw as the type of killer who enjoyed the process more than the outcome. In prison, Shaw remained eerily composed. Guards described him as polite but detached, reading psychology books and spending hours drawing intricate patterns. He never showed aggression, but his eyes, they said, were completely dead. Occasionally, Shaw would toy with detectives, claiming to know about other murders, only to withdraw at the last moment. He once told Detective Michael during a visit, "You think you caught me because of science. You didn't. I let you." When Michael pressed him for details about his earlier crimes, Shaw only smiled faintly and said, "There are things buried out there that will never be found. Let them sleep. That was the last time he ever spoke of his crimes. In 2021, after more than 2 decades in prison, Sebastian Shaw was found dead in his cell at the Oregon State Penitentiary. The cause was ruled as natural, though some officers noted he had refused medical treatment for months. His death brought no closure, only silence. After his death, detectives revisited every file connected to him. Over the next 2 years, forensic retesting with modern technology revealed additional partial DNA matches from unsolved cases in California and Washington, but none strong enough for formal charges. To this day, investigators believe Shaw may have been responsible for up to 12 murders between 1988 and 1995, possibly more. His case remains a haunting study in criminal psychology, a reminder of how a man can live quietly among society while carrying out unspeakable acts in the shadows. For Portland, the name Sebastian Shaw still sends a shiver down the spine. The people who remember those years still recall the fear, the quiet tension that gripped neighborhoods when the Portland Predator was still out there. Detective John, now retired, later reflected in an interview, he wasn't just a killer, he was a ghost, always one step ahead. If DNA hadn't caught up to him, I believe he'd still be walking among us today. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all, Shaw himself once hinted that there was another man who shared his interests, a possible accomplice, someone who, according to him, liked to watch. Whether that was a manipulative lie or a dark truth is something investigators have never been able to prove. But even now, decades later, that statement leaves a chilling possibility hanging over the case, that somewhere out there, another predator might still be watching, waiting, just like Shaw once did, by his father. This incident marked the definitive breakdown of their relationship. Shaw moved out soon after, cutting nearly all contact with his father. From that point on, he began drifting from place to place, working odd jobs and renting cheap rooms, often changing locations without notice. Friends and acquaintances from that period later recalled that Shaw had grown increasingly bitter, paranoid, and resentful toward authority. He often spoke about how people didn't respect him and how the world owed him something. By the late 1980s, Shaw's life had taken a darker turn. He began accumulating an alarming number of weapons, survival tools, and military-style gear. Investigators later found in his apartment an entire arsenal: knives, firearms, night vision goggles, rope, duct tape, and even chloroform. These weren't the possessions of an ordinary citizen. They were the tools of someone preparing for control, domination, or violence. It was around this time that Shaw legally changed his name from Jiao Kwang Ho to Sebastian Shaw, perhaps an attempt to erase his past or reinvent himself under a new identity. Neighbors described him as quiet but creepy. He rarely spoke, avoided eye contact, and seemed to observe people more than interact with them. There was something unsettling about the way he lingered near children's playgrounds or watched women walking alone. Though no one had direct proof of criminal behavior, several neighbors admitted that his presence made them uneasy. Police psychologists who later examined Shaw's background noted clear signs of an antisocial personality disorder. His early abandonment, lack of maternal affection, and exposure to violence likely stunted his emotional development. Over time, this emotional void may have transformed into a deep desire to assert control over others, a hallmark trait among serial offenders. In 1991, after being fired from his job for harassment, Shaw's behavior worsened. He began visiting shooting ranges frequently and was often seen driving aimlessly late at night. Surveillance records later revealed that during this period, several unsolved assaults occurred in the same areas he frequented. However, at the time, no one connected the dots. The real horror began in 1992, when 23-year-old Jennifer Lynn was found murdered in Portland. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Detectives discovered unique ligature marks on her wrists and neck, consistent with the use of a particular type of nylon cord, the same type Shaw was known to possess. Unfortunately, DNA technology at the time was still in its infancy, and while biological samples were collected, they could not yet be definitively linked to a suspect. 3 years later, in 1995, 21-year-old Amanda Kopova barely escaped with her life after being attacked in a parking lot. She fought back fiercely and survived, giving police the first clear description of her attacker, an Asian man in his late 20s. Short hair, calm but terrifyingly cold eyes. She recalled his voice as flat, emotionless, like someone reading from a script. When Shaw's DNA was finally matched in 1998, detectives were both relieved and disturbed. The man they had captured wasn't a frenzied killer. He was calm, calculated, and chillingly articulate. During interrogation, Shaw initially denied everything, maintaining a blank expression, but when confronted with the DNA results, his demeanor shifted slightly, not guilt, but curiosity. He asked investigators, "How long did it take you to find that cigarette?" It was a subtle admission. Further investigation revealed that Shaw had meticulously planned his attacks. He often stalked victims for weeks, studying their routines and choosing locations where escape was difficult. His victims were typically young women who lived alone or had predictable schedules. He took trophy small items like earrings, scarves, or even strands of hair, which were later discovered hidden in a metal box beneath his floorboards. In court, prosecutors portrayed Shaw as a manipulative predator who viewed his victims as experiments. Psychiatrists testified that he displayed traits consistent with sadistic tendencies, deriving psychological satisfaction from watching his victims struggle. One expert described Shaw as a man who believed he was enacting justice in a world that had wronged him. During the trial, Shaw remained eerily calm. He showed no visible remorse, even when victims' families delivered emotional testimonies. When asked if he wanted to apologize, Shaw simply said, "What would that change?" In 1999, Sebastian Shaw was convicted on multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, and sexual assault. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, the story didn't end there. Years later, in prison, Shaw began corresponding with criminology students and journalists, presenting himself as a misunderstood genius. He claimed that his killings were part of a social experiment meant to test human fragility and control. Though these statements were dismissed as manipulative and delusional, they revealed the depth of his narcissism. In 2021, after more than 2 decades behind bars, Shaw died in prison from natural causes. Even in his final years, he refused to cooperate with cold case investigators, who suspected his involvement in other unsolved murders across Oregon and Washington. To this day, authorities believe Sebastian Shaw may have claimed the lives of at least 5 more victims whose identities remain unknown. His story serves as a chilling reminder that beneath a quiet exterior can lurk unimaginable darkness, one that only patience, forensic innovation, and relentless pursuit can finally bring to light. During the extended investigation, authorities uncovered an even deeper and more disturbing portrait of Sebastian Shaw. They found that his crimes weren't impulsive acts of rage. They were the result of careful planning and deliberate cruelty. Detectives began reconstructing his movements in the months before and after each murder, revealing a chilling pattern of stalking and preparation. Shaw often spent weeks observing his potential victims, learning their routines, and identifying moments of vulnerability. Through witness statements and old surveillance footage, investigators pieced together that Shaw frequently visited isolated areas such as parking lots, jogging trails, and apartment complexes where single women lived alone. It became evident that his crimes were not random, as initially thought. Instead, they were carefully orchestrated opportunities for control, a reflection of his desire to dominate others after feeling powerless for most of his life. A psychological evaluation conducted by forensic experts described Shaw as a textbook example of a psychopathic killer. He displayed zero empathy, had a grandiose sense of self, and took pleasure in manipulating those around him. One of the psychiatrists later testified that Shaw saw himself as an agent of chaos, someone who believed his actions were a form of poetic justice against a world he viewed as unfair. Further, evidence solidified this assessment. In his diary, Shaw often wrote about balancing the scales and testing human fragility. He saw his victims as experiments, not people. Each attack, in his mind, was a way to reaffirm his control and superiority. Police also traced several anonymous phone calls Shaw had made in the weeks before certain crimes. These calls were made from payphones near the victims' neighborhoods and were believed to be his way of toying with them before striking, although the content of the calls could not be fully recovered. Two victims' acquaintances reported receiving eerie, silent phone calls in the days before the attacks, a psychological tactic meant to instill fear. When all this information was presented in court, the picture of Sebastian Shaw as a remorseless predator became undeniable. The prosecution described him as a man driven by hatred, sustained by cruelty, and obsessed with control. Every piece of evidence, from his blood-stained knife to the disturbing confessions in his journal, painted the same portrait: a deeply disturbed individual who derived satisfaction from the suffering of others. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Shaw never once admitted guilt. During trial sessions, he sat motionless, occasionally smirking when prosecutors read the details of his crimes. Witnesses and journalists present in the courtroom described his demeanor as ice-cold, almost robotic. Even his defense team struggled to explain his actions. They argued that Shaw's difficult childhood, combined with his exposure to violence in the military, had warped his mental stability, but the jury was unmoved. The diary entries, the DNA matches, and the weapon evidence left no room for doubt. When the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts, Shaw showed no emotion. He simply stared ahead, expressionless, as if the entire trial were an irrelevant performance. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never harm anyone again. However, the shadow of Sebastian Shaw's crimes continued to haunt investigators long after his conviction. Several unsolved murders in Oregon and Northern California bore striking similarities to his methods. The same bindings, the same ligature marks, the same level of precision, although direct evidence was lacking. Many detectives believed Shaw's true victim count was far higher than confirmed. In the years following his imprisonment, Shaw remained largely silent, granting only a handful of interviews to journalists and criminology students. In these rare interactions, he spoke about his crimes with chilling detachment, describing murder as a psychological experiment and referring to his victims as subjects. One interviewer later described the experience as staring into the abyss. Sebastian Shaw's case became one of Oregon's most studied examples of organized psychopathy, a terrifying reminder of how ordinary appearances can conceal monstrous intent. His transformation from a troubled young man into a remorseless killer illustrated the dangerous intersection of trauma, narcissism, and unchecked rage. Even decades after his death in prison, Shaw's name remains synonymous with calculated evil, a man who used intelligence not for creation or compassion, but for cruelty and control. This shocking revelation left the courtroom stunned. Prosecutors disclosed that Shaw had once been given a chance to avoid execution if he cooperated fully and confessed to all his crimes, but his refusal over something as trivial as smoking privileges revealed just how cold and self-centered he truly was. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor said, "This man values cigarettes more than human life." The defense team, realizing the impossibility of proving innocence, attempted to shift the focus toward Shaw's mental state. They portrayed him as a deeply traumatized man, the product of a violent upbringing, who had never received proper psychological help. They argued that Shaw's unstable mind and past military experience had contributed to his breakdown and eventual descent into violence. But the jury saw through this argument. The careful planning, the detailed notes, and the deliberate cruelty in his crimes were not the actions of someone who had lost control. They were the actions of a man who enjoyed having it. Throughout the proceedings, Shaw remained disturbingly detached. He showed no remorse when photos of his victims were displayed, no emotion when families sobbed in the courtroom. Occasionally, he smiled faintly, as though watching a show put on for his amusement. Reporters covering the trial described his demeanor as eerie, a man who seemed almost proud of what he had done. When it was time for Shaw to speak in his own defense, he stood up, straightened his prison uniform, and addressed the jury with chilling arrogance. "You can judge me all you want," he said coldly, "but the truth is, people like me will always exist. You can kill one monster, and another will rise." His words sent a wave of discomfort through the courtroom. Even his defense attorneys looked horrified. After weeks of testimony and overwhelming evidence, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their decision: guilty of first-degree murder. The next phase, determining his punishment, was just as swift. The prosecution argued that Shaw's total lack of empathy, his repeated acts of violence, and his refusal to cooperate with law enforcement made him a continuing danger to society, even behind bars. The defense pleaded for mercy, but their efforts were futile. On May 17, 2006, the judge read the verdict aloud. Sebastian Shaw, for the brutal and senseless murder of Mr. J. Rick Bayal, this court sentences you to death. Even then, Shaw didn't flinch. He merely nodded slightly, almost as if he had expected it, or perhaps welcomed it. The families of his victims, who had waited more than a decade for justice, wept quietly in relief. The monster who had terrorized Portland and beyond was finally facing the ultimate consequence for his actions. While Shaw was sent to death row, his case remained a subject of fascination for criminologists and journalists. Many wondered whether his claim of having killed 13 people was true. Over the following years, investigators from multiple states reviewed dozens of unsolved murders, hoping to link them to Shaw through DNA or forensic similarities. Although a few cases showed potential connections, none were conclusively proven. In the end, Sebastian Shaw spent the rest of his life behind bars, isolated from the world he once sought to terrorize. He continued to show no remorse, often refusing to speak during interviews. Guards who interacted with him described him as eerily calm, always polite, always emotionless. Some even said he seemed to enjoy the fear he inspired just by his presence. Shaw never made it to the execution chamber. In October 2021, after more than 15 years on death row, he was found dead in his cell from natural causes at the age of 53. The news of his death brought a strange mix of closure and frustration to those who had followed the case. On one hand, the monster was finally gone. On the other, he had taken many secrets with him, perhaps the identities of victims who would never be known, or the full truth behind his cryptic confession of 13 murders. In the words of one Portland detective who had pursued Shaw for years, he died the same way he lived, without a shred of remorse, without giving anyone peace. But at least now, no one else will ever suffer at his hands again. Inside a small handbag tossed carelessly into the corner of the room, investigators discovered the first crucial clue to the victim's identity. Among the blood-stained contents, a few coins, a compact mirror, and a set of keys, lay a national identification card. The name printed on it read, Lin Shinru, a 32-year-old woman. Alongside the ID, officers also found a mobile phone smeared with dried blood. When they powered it on, the screen immediately lit up with a string of missed calls and unread messages. most of them from a single contact labeled Chen. This discovery caused an uneasy silence among the officers. The name matched that of the blood-stained man they had just detained, Chen, a 35-year-old construction worker who lived in the same apartment. It didn't take long before investigators began piecing together the outline of a devastating domestic tragedy. As detectives continued combing through the apartment, the picture grew clearer and more disturbing. On the victim's phone, a recently sent text message draft was still open, unfinished, as if she had been interrupted mid. It read, "If anything happens to me, it will be Chen. Please." The message stopped abruptly there, frozen in time, like the victim's final cry for help. Nearby, a crumpled envelope was found addressed to the Taipei Women's Protection Center, containing a formal request for emergency relocation due to domestic abuse. The timestamp on the document revealed it had been prepared only a day before her murder. All of these findings painted a chilling narrative. Lin Shenru had spent months trapped in a cycle of fear and violence, desperately trying to break free. The protective order on the floor, stamped just hours earlier, became a grim symbol of her final attempt to save herself. Evidence. The findings left no room for doubt. The physical proof overwhelmingly pointed to Hong as the perpetrator of this brutal act. Every piece of evidence, from the blood on his clothes to the fingerprints on the weapon, told the same undeniable story. The investigation team had officially confirmed that the man standing in the hallway in a drunken haze was, in fact, Hang Donghai, the victim's husband and the killer. To ensure no procedural gaps, the forensic department submitted a detailed report outlining all key findings. The murder weapon, a betel nut cutting knife, was firmly linked to Hong through fingerprint and DNA analysis. The blood samples on his shirt, pants, and even beneath his fingernails matched the victim's DNA profile. The forensic timeline matched eyewitness reports, placing the attack between 2:40 and 2:50 p.m., mere minutes after the victim had returned from the police station with her newly issued protective order. These converging pieces of evidence created a grim and irrefutable narrative. The crime was not an impulsive accident. It was the culmination of escalating domestic abuse that had reached its fatal breaking point. In addition, investigators also retrieved CCTV footage from a small convenience store near the apartment. The footage showed Nin Luang walking hurriedly past the shop around 2:20 p.m., holding a brown envelope, later confirmed to be the protective order application. Less than half an hour later, the same camera captured Hong, visibly intoxicated, stumbling in the same direction toward the apartment. Complex. This chilling sequence offered a clear reconstruction of events. After leaving the police station, Nin likely returned home to collect her belongings or check on her children. But Hong, realizing she had sought legal protection and planned to leave him, followed her home in a drunken rage. Inside the apartment, their confrontation quickly turned violent, ending in bloodshed that stained the very papers meant to protect her. By the end of the day, detectives had compiled enough irrefutable evidence to charge Hang Donghai with premeditated murder. Yet, as shocking as the case was, it also revealed deeper societal wounds, the tragic gap between the issuance of protection and the reality of its enforcement, a delay of mere hours that cost an innocent woman her life. Home later that afternoon, still holding the stamped protective order in her hand, his rage reignited instantly. In his drunken and jealous state, Hang claimed that seeing the document felt like a personal humiliation, proof that his wife no longer feared him and had chosen to defy his control. He told investigators that their argument escalated quickly. "She kept saying she didn't want to live with me anymore," he recounted coldly. "Then she called me useless and said I couldn't even provide for the family. That's when I snapped." According to his own confession, he grabbed the betel nut cutting knife from the kitchen counter and swung it toward her without hesitation. The first strike landed on her shoulder, but when she turned and tried to run, he slashed again, this time across her neck. As she stumbled into the hallway, bleeding and gasping for air, he followed her out, still shouting curses. Then, realizing she was collapsing, he stopped, not out of guilt, but exhaustion. Throughout the interrogation, Heng showed no sign of remorse. His tone remained disturbingly calm, even boastful, as he described how he had taught her a lesson. When asked if he had planned the attack, he insisted it wasn't premeditated, claiming it was a moment of uncontrollable anger. However, investigators found inconsistencies in his statement. The timeline of events, witness testimonies, and his earlier behavior painted a far darker picture. He had gone to his wife's workplace in the morning to publicly humiliate her, then continued drinking before returning home to confront her again. This sequence suggested a deliberate pattern of pursuit and escalation, not a sudden outburst. Moreover, detectives discovered that Heng had a history of domestic abuse, with several unreported incidents corroborated by neighbors who often heard screams, crying, and the sound of objects breaking late at night. One neighbor even recalled seeing Feng with visible bruises a few weeks prior, though she had quietly brushed off concern by saying she had fallen. By the end of the interrogation, the picture was complete. Heng's actions were driven by rage, jealousy, and a need to reassert dominance over a woman who finally dared to stand up to him. His confession, the forensic evidence, and the eyewitness testimonies formed a seamless web of proof. At 3:45 a.m. on March 2nd, the Taipei police officially charged Heng Dong Hai with murder under aggravating circumstances, a crime carrying the possibility of the death penalty under Taiwanese law. What made the case especially haunting was its cruel irony. Less than 1 hour before her death, Nin Lufang had placed her final hope in the justice system. The very document meant to protect her, the emergency protection order, had become a blood-stained testament to how fate and bureaucracy failed her at the same time, with the protective order still clutched in her trembling hands. Another heated argument erupted between them. Heng, already deep in his drunken haze, began mumbling angry curses, his words slurred but laced with venom. Yet this time, Fang was no longer the silent, submissive woman he was used to. She stood her ground, raising her voice in defiance. For the first time, she held up the protective order before him and shouted that she would no longer tolerate the abuse, that the law would protect her now. That single act, a woman daring to resist, shattered the fragile control Hang thought he still had. Consumed by rage, he lunged toward the table, grabbed the betel nut cutting knife, and without a moment's hesitation, began hacking violently at his wife. Fang's screams filled the apartment, echoing through the hallways. Even as she stumbled out into the corridor, blood pouring from her neck, Hang made no attempt to stop or help her. Instead, he stood motionless, muttering bitter curses as her body collapsed to the ground. The heartless indifference he displayed left even the most hardened detectives speechless. But as the hours of interrogation dragged on, investigators began to see through Hang's cold, calculated facade. Subtle inconsistencies in his story revealed his attempt to minimize responsibility and frame the killing as an unfortunate accident. He repeated the same excuses, that he was too drunk to think straight, and that he had been provoked by his wife's words. However, the lead investigator noticed the cracks. If Hang had truly lost control, why had he stopped after the fatal strike? Why didn't he keep attacking in blind fury? Why didn't he attempt to destroy evidence or flee? His selective restraint contradicted his entire defense of temporary insanity. These contradictions were carefully documented, evidence that would later become invaluable to prosecutors seeking a murder conviction without leniency. Meanwhile, police delved deeper into Hang's background, assisted by criminal psychology experts, to understand his behavioral patterns. Although his criminal record showed no major felonies, he had multiple prior incidents involving public intoxication and violent outbursts. More troubling, however, was the discovery that Hang had been on a domestic violence watch list for years. Records from the Wanhua police station revealed at least 3 prior domestic violence complaints filed by Fang herself. Each time, the same pattern repeated, a violent episode. Police intervention, Hang's shallow apology, and finally, Fang's decision to withdraw the report out of fear and dependency. Investigators noted how tragically familiar this pattern was. Victims trapped by emotional manipulation, economic vulnerability, and cultural isolation, forced into silence while the abuse worsened. Fang's case was no different. Her forgiveness had only fueled her husband's contempt for the law and inflated his belief that he could act with impunity. Interviews with neighbors and acquaintances painted a disturbing portrait of Hang Dong-hai, a man of rigid patriarchy and toxic pride. To him, his young Vietnamese wife was not a partner, but a possession. He viewed her obedience as a matter of male honor, and her defiance as humiliation. He forbade her from forming friendships, restricted her movements, and controlled the household finances. Experts later described Hang as a pathological patriarch, a man whose fragile ego and deep insecurities transformed into obsessive jealousy and control. His violent outbursts were not the product of drunken impulse but of a deeply ingrained mindset that viewed women as inferior. When Fang finally broke that silence, when she dared to fight back and sought protection from the authorities, Hang's delusion of control shattered completely. His final act of violence was not a spontaneous eruption of anger, but a deliberate attempt to restore dominance through destruction. Based on the forensic findings, psychological profiling, and eyewitness testimony, police reconstructed the full sequence of events leading to the tragedy. On the morning of March 1, 2012, Fang woke early, as usual, to prepare breakfast for her 2 daughters. Her husband, still recovering from heavy drinking the previous night, lay sprawled on the bed, groggy and irritable. His first words of the day were drunken complaints and curses. Fang ignored him. She was used to the hostility. After feeding the children and walking them to school, she rode her bicycle to her workplace, a small leather shoe factory in For a few brief hours, she escaped the oppressive silence of her home. But at around 10 a.m., that fragile peace shattered again. Hang showed up at her workplace, reeking of alcohol and fury. His drunken haze had started to fade, but what replaced it was far more dangerous. A storm of delusional thoughts fueled by alcohol and jealousy. Twisted scenarios began forming in his mind, each more absurd than the last. Visions of his wife laughing with other men, of secret affairs, of betrayal. The more he imagined, the more convinced he became that it was real. His pulse quickened, anger boiled over, and in that drunken fog of suspicion, he decided he would go to the shoe factory himself and see the truth. Before leaving, Hang poured himself another drink, a final gulp of liquid courage that only deepened his madness. Moments later, the quiet rhythm of the shoe factory was shattered by a sudden outburst of rage. Workers froze as a disheveled man, reeking of alcohol, stumbled through the entrance, his wild eyes darting across the room. Without a word, he slammed his fists on the work tables, sending the echo of metal and tools clattering through the air. Panic rippled across the workshop as he shouted his wife's name. When Fang saw him, her heart dropped. Humiliation washed over her as her colleagues turned to watch. She rushed forward, trembling, pleading for him to stop, but her desperate attempt to calm him only made things worse. Hang's voice rose to a furious roar as he hurled vile accusations, claiming she was having an affair with the factory owner. The owner stepped out to intervene, trying to de-escalate the situation, but Hang's anger exploded. He lunged forward, screaming insults and threats, his hands trembling with rage. Realizing things had spiraled out of control, the owner quickly called the police. Minutes later, 2 officers arrived to find Hang still gripping his wife's arm, shouting incoherently as she sobbed, her face pale from fear and humiliation. The officers restrained him, demanding identification. Though he tried to resist, he was easily subdued and escorted out, while Fang stood trembling before her co-workers, tears streaming down her face. At the police station, the factory owner filed a statement, his voice filled with disgust as he described Hang's violent intrusion. Fang, still shaking, bowed her head and apologized repeatedly for her husband's behavior. The officers warned Hang sternly. His public disturbance could be treated as a serious offense, but since no one pressed charges, the law limited their power. They made him sign a written pledge not to repeat his actions, then released him around 12:30 p.m. It should have ended there, but no one, not even the officers, could have known that letting him go would lead to a tragedy just hours later. Meanwhile, Fang sat in silence at her workplace, overwhelmed with shame, fear, and exhaustion. For years, she had endured his temper, hoping he would change. But now, after the morning's humiliation, something inside her broke. When her boss allowed her to leave early, she didn't go home. She went straight to Wan police station. At 1:30 p.m., with swollen eyes and trembling hands, she entered the station. Because her Chinese was limited, officers called an interpreter. Through sobs, she described years of abuse, threats, and the violent outburst earlier that morning. The officers listened carefully, comforting her as they helped her file an emergency protective order under domestic violence laws, though there were no prior reports. The officers moved swiftly, drafting the order that barred her husband from approaching or contacting her. The court would need days to review the full case, but for now, they issued a temporary protective certificate, hoping it might at least deter him. At 1:40 p.m., Fang left the police station holding the paper tightly, a fragile symbol of safety and hope after years of terror. For the first time, she believed the law might finally protect her, but destiny had something far crueler in store. While she was still at the station, Hang had already returned home, seething with rage. Around 1:15 p.m., he sat drinking again, muttering curses to himself. His anger simmered until the sound of keys turning in the lock made his head snap up. When Fang stepped through the door at 1:50 p.m., she froze. Her husband sat cross-legged at the table, eyes red, expression twisted with hate. He began hurling insults, his voice sharp and venomous. But this time, Fang refused to stay silent, summoning all her courage. She pulled the protective order from her purse, held it up in front of him, and said with trembling defiance, "If you ever touch me again, you'll go to jail." For a brief second, silence filled the room, then Hang burst into a mocking laugh. He snatched the paper from her hand, tore it into pieces, and threw it on the floor. Fang, shaking with anger and grief, shouted the words that sealed her fate. "You're useless." It was a spark in a room full of gasoline. Hang roared in fury, grabbed the betel nut cutting knife from the table, and swung it toward her. Fang barely had time to step back once, before understanding nothing of what was happening. Fang froze, just as her husband's arm slashed through the air. The knife struck her directly across the neck. A choking, gurgling sound escaped her lips as she instinctively clutched at the wound, blood seeping rapidly between her fingers. Driven by sheer survival instinct, she stumbled toward the door, leaving a trail of crimson behind her. She managed to stagger barely 10 meters around 33 feet, into the hallway before collapsing, gasping for help as her strength faded. The entire scene unfolded in less than 10 seconds. The corridor erupted in chaos. Neighbors screamed when they saw her body hit the floor, blood spreading swiftly across the tiles. Moments later, Heng stepped out of the apartment, his face eerily blank. He stared at his wife's motionless body, twitching slightly, as if unsure whether to move closer. Then, with chilling composure, he dropped the blood-stained knife onto the ground. raised both hands in surrender, and lit a cigarette, as the smell of smoke mixed with blood in the narrow hallway. He leaned against the wall, expressionless, his lips curling into a strange, twisted smile before fading into a hollow stare. Within minutes, the wail of police and ambulance sirens filled the air. Medical responders rushed in, lifting Fang's lifeless body onto a stretcher, while officers restrained Hang and led him away. His clothes were soaked in blood, but his face remained calm, even when cameras flashed around him. He showed no sign of remorse. To prevent suicide, escape, or further harm to their 2 young children, police ordered him held in custody, pending a full investigation. Over the following weeks, detectives meticulously gathered evidence, forensic results, witness statements, and testimony from Fang's relatives in Vietnam. Every detail was examined to rule out other possibilities. The findings were conclusive. Hang Dong-hai had single-handedly murdered his wife, Ninh Lu, at approximately 2:30 p.m. on March 1, 2012. The crime stemmed from long-standing domestic conflict, fueled by alcohol and rage. The case was transferred to prosecutors, and by August 2012, the Taipei District Court opened the first trial. Prosecutors demanded the maximum penalty, death or life imprisonment, arguing that Hang's actions demonstrated deliberate cruelty toward a woman who had already sought protection under the law. They presented overwhelming evidence: his confession, forensic reports, and witness testimony. The court-appointed defense attorney tried to argue for leniency, claiming Hang had been provoked, intoxicated, and momentarily lost control after being insulted by his wife. The lawyer also highlighted Hang's poverty and lack of education, pleading for a chance at rehabilitation. But the prosecution swiftly dismantled the argument. They emphasized that Hang's drinking was habitual and voluntary, that his violence was not a one-time lapse but a pattern of abuse, and that after the murder, he had calmly smoked a cigarette while watching his wife die, proof of cold, conscious awareness, not drunken confusion. Throughout the hearings, Hang sat mostly in silence, head bowed. When the judge asked repeatedly whether he felt remorse, his response sent shockwaves through the courtroom. "If I did it again, I'd still discipline my wife," he muttered, "but maybe a little gentler." The chilling remark sealed his fate. Even his defense attorney fell silent, realizing the case was beyond saving. When the verdict was read, the court declared that Hang had committed premeditated murder with extreme cruelty, yet, taking into account his momentary provocation and middle age, the judges spared him the death penalty, sentencing him instead to life imprisonment with permanent revocation of his civil rights. He remained expressionless as the verdict was delivered, but within days, under the encouragement of a fellow inmate, Hang filed an appeal, again insisting he deserved a reduced sentence, still claiming drunkenness and provocation as excuses for his loss of control. On the afternoon of Thursday, July 6, 2017, the Doylestown Police Department in Pennsylvania, USA, received a distress call from Mr. Richard, an elderly man reporting that his 19-year-old grandson, Jimmy, had gone missing. It was during his first summer break from college that Jimmy suddenly vanished without a trace. Around 6 p.m. on Wednesday, July 5th, he told his grandfather he was heading out to grab dinner with some friends at a nearby fast food restaurant. He promised he'd be back soon, but as the hours passed, concern began to grow. By 2 a.m., Jimmy still hadn't returned home. His phone was off, and calls went straight to voicemail. His grandparents, especially his grandmother, spent the entire night anxiously texting him messages that went unanswered. When morning came with still no sign of him, Richard, his grandfather, decided to call the police. At first, authorities didn't take the report seriously. It wasn't unusual, they reasoned, for college students to stay out all night without informing family. Maybe Jimmy had gone to a party or stayed over with friends. Most missing young adults, in their experience, turned up after a few days. But this time, the police were wrong. A full day passed, and there was still no word from Jimmy. His car remained untouched in the garage, and his phone was still disconnected. Realizing something was very wrong, investigators began treating the case as a possible abduction or foul play. Detectives started reaching out to Jimmy's girlfriend and close friends, but none of them had seen or heard from him on July 5th. His grandparents couldn't recall who had picked him up that evening, if anyone had at all, with no witnesses and no leads. Investigators decided to trace Jimmy's final phone signal. The results were unexpected. The last recorded ping came from Springfield, a town roughly an hour and 20 minutes from his grandparents' home. There was no reason Jimmy would travel that far for a casual dinner. That discovery shifted the tone of the PUN investigation completely. Believing they might be dealing with something far more serious, police launched a large-scale search operation around the Springfield area, coordinating with family, friends, and volunteers. But before that search could produce results, something even stranger happened. Just one day later, on Friday, July 7th, 2017, police received another report, another missing young man. This time, the victim was Dean, a 19-year-old from Middletown, Pennsylvania. Dean was known for his love of adventure, scooters, dirt bikes, and anything with an engine. But unlike Jimmy, he had a troubled background. Dean had struggled in school and had several prior arrests for assault, drug possession, and driving under the influence. Still, to his family, he was their son, flawed, but loved. On the night of July 7th, Dean had dinner with his father Anthony at a local sushi restaurant. When they returned home around 7 p.m., Dean said he was going out to meet a friend nearby and would be back soon. He was scheduled to work a night shift that evening, but, just like Jimmy, he never came back. His phone went dead not long after he left. When Anthony realized Dean had neither gone to work nor responded to calls or texts, panic set in. He immediately called the police. Anthony recalled that while he was doing laundry in the basement, he had briefly asked Dean who he was going to meet. Dean only replied vaguely, "A friend nearby." That was the last time anyone in his family saw him alive, within just 2 days. Two young men, strangers to each other, had vanished under eerily similar circumstances. But the nightmare didn't stop there. That same evening, July 7th around 6 p.m., another man, Mark, age 22, told his father he was heading out to meet his friend Tom. The two had been close since high school and now worked together at Mark's father's construction company. But that night, both Mark and Tom disappeared. The next morning, when neither showed up for work, their parents called the police. An alarm. Tom, 21, came from a modest single-parent household and lived with his mother and 2 younger sisters. Diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, he required daily insulin injections. Despite his own challenges, Tom was known as a kind and responsible young man who often helped care for his family. After briefly studying architecture in college, he dropped out in 2015 to work full-time alongside his best friend. Marked out now, both were missing by July 8th. Investigators had compiled 4 separate missing persons cases: Jimmy, Dean, Tom, and Mark, all vanishing within 48 hours of each other. At first glance, the young men had little in common. They lived in different towns: Jimmy in New Hope, Dean in Middletown, Tom in Plumstead, and Mark in Pennsylvania. They didn't attend the same schools, didn't share workplaces, and had no known social connections. But there was one chilling similarity. All were young men aged 19 to 22, and all had disappeared suddenly after saying they were going to meet a friend. 3 of them, Dean, Tom, and Mark, vanished on the same evening, July 7th. The case quickly gripped public attention. Local newspapers, television stations, and social media erupted with speculation. Families pleaded for help. Hundreds of volunteers joined police in massive search operations across Bucks County. Recognizing the pattern, the FBI and state investigative units stepped in. What began as isolated local cases was now being treated as a coordinated criminal investigation through phone data analysis. Detectives discovered a critical clue. Dean's final cell signal had been traced to a large rural farm near Doylestown, an isolated area with rough terrain and few residents. Convinced the property could hold the key, police assembled a task force and began an exhaustive ground search. Then, in the early hours of July 9, 2017, the investigation finally broke open at 2:10 a.m. An officer on patrol found Mark's Nissan parked at the Peddler's Village shopping center, just minutes away from the Doylestown farm. The vehicle was immediately impounded as evidence. 2 hours later, at 4 a.m., another search team scouring the nearby farmland discovered Tom's Nissan Maxima parked in a garage behind a residential property. The car doors were locked, but inside were Tom's insurance documents and a set of car keys, hanging neatly on the wall, as if someone had intentionally left everything in order. When officers forced the door open to inspect the vehicle, what they found inside would send shockwaves through Pennsylvania. Issues infrequently clashed with both doctors and family members. He insisted he was perfectly fine and that everyone else was trying to control him. During his hospital stay, Cosmo would often erupt in violent outbursts, shouting at nurses and accusing his parents of conspiring against him. His mother, Sandra, later admitted that her son's mood swings were terrifying. One moment he was quiet and withdrawn, the next he was screaming uncontrollably, smashing objects, or threatening to harm himself. Despite the severity of his condition, Cosmo was eventually discharged after a few weeks of treatment, though doctors strongly advised continued psychiatric care. However, he refused to take his prescribed medication, claiming it dulled his senses. Instead, he turned to drugs, using marijuana and painkillers to feel normal. His addiction deepened rapidly, and the once promising young man became even more unstable and paranoid. By early 2017, Cosmo's erratic behavior had reached alarming levels. Neighbors reported hearing gunshots echoing late at night from the farm. Others claimed to see him pacing around shirtless in the fields, muttering to himself while carrying a shotgun. His father, Antonio, tried to intervene several times, but Cosmo's violent temper made it nearly impossible to control him. Fearing for their safety, the family avoided provoking him and often stayed away from the property altogether. Meanwhile, Cosmo began bragging to local teenagers that he could get them the best weed in Pennsylvania. He lured young men to the farm under the pretense of selling drugs, a setup that would later prove deadly. His social media posts grew darker, filled with cryptic captions, gun photos, and violent imagery. In one chilling post, he wrote, "People don't really disappear. They just end up where they belong." Police would later describe Cosmo as a volatile blend of narcissism, rage, and mental instability, someone who viewed life and death as games of control. Despite his obvious deterioration, no one could have predicted how far his violent impulses were about to go. The farm, once a symbol of his family's wealth and success, was slowly turning into something much darker, a hunting ground for a disturbed mind. And soon, it would become the scene of one of the most horrifying crimes in Pennsylvania's history. Once they arrived, Cosmo led Jimmy to a remote spot on the farm under the pretext of showing him where the marijuana was stored. The two walked for several minutes through tall grass and dirt paths, until they reached a quiet clearing surrounded by trees. There, without warning, Cosmo pulled out a .22 caliber rifle and shot Jimmy in the head. The shot was so sudden that Jimmy never had the chance to react or defend himself. After killing him, Cosmo used a backhoe from the property to dig a shallow pit. He dumped Jimmy's body inside, covered it with dirt, and returned home as if nothing had happened. The next morning, he sold Jimmy's cell phone and burned his backpack to eliminate any evidence. 2 days later, Cosmo decided to kill again. This time, he called Dean, pretending to arrange another drug deal. According to Cosmo's confession, Dean agreed to buy a quarter pound of marijuana for $800. Around 6 p.m. on July 7th, Cosmo drove his black Ford pickup truck to pick up Dean from his home in Middletown. They chatted casually on the way back to the farm, and Cosmo even offered Dean a cigarette laced with marijuana to relax. When they arrived at the farm, Cosmo told Dean they needed to ride an ATV deeper into the property to get the drugs. Dean climbed onto the back of the vehicle, and as they reached a desolate area, Cosmo pulled out a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum revolver and shot Dean once in the back of the head. After confirming that Dean was dead, Cosmo used a tractor to dig another hole and buried his body nearby. Shockingly, that same evening, Cosmo decided to kill again. He called Tom and Mark, offering them a great deal on weed, 10 pounds for a cheap price. The two friends, unaware of what had happened to the others, agreed to meet him at his farm later that night, when Tom and Mark arrived around 7:45 p.m. Cosmo acted friendly, even helping them park their car. They chatted about the deal, and Cosmo suggested taking them out back to see the stash. But as soon as they reached the edge of the property, Cosmo pulled out his revolver again and shot Mark first. Tom tried to run, but Cosmo chased him, firing several more shots until Tom collapsed. In his statement, Cosmo later claimed that Tom wouldn't stop screaming, so he shot him one last time to shut him up. After killing both, Cosmo tried to bury them separately, but the effort took too long. He decided to throw their bodies into the same hole he had already dug for Dean, creating a mass grave to destroy evidence. Cosmo poured gasoline into the pit and set the bodies on fire, watching as thick black smoke rose into the night sky. He later said he burned them because the smell was unbearable. When police asked him why he had done it, Cosmo's responses were chillingly detached. He said he had killed them over money and trust issues. But investigators believed his motives were far darker, rooted in mental illness, anger, and an obsession with control. He admitted to killing Jimmy on July 5th, burying him alone, and later burning his remains in a metal tank on July 8th. Cosmo even returned to the site to check if the fire had completely destroyed the evidence. After listening to his confession, detectives and FBI agents led Cosmo back to the farm, where he pointed out the exact burial locations. Following his directions, police excavated another area behind a metal tank, and there, they discovered Jimmy's charred remains. All 4 victims were finally accounted for. The community that had spent days searching in hope now faced the grim truth. 4 young men, full of life and promise, had fallen victim to one disturbed killer. On July 15, 2017, Cosmo DiNardo was officially charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and abuse of a corpse. His cousin, Sean Kratz, was later charged as an accomplice after police found evidence that he had participated in one of the killings. During his court appearance, Cosmo showed no emotion. When the judge asked if he understood the charges against him, he simply nodded. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Cosmo pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without parole. In the end, the case shocked Pennsylvania and the entire nation, not only for its brutality, but for how a privileged young man, born into wealth and opportunity, became a cold-blooded murderer. The DiNardo farm was later sold, its land left quiet and empty. Yet, even years later, locals still avoid passing through at night. To them, it's no longer just farmland. It's a place where 4 innocent souls were lost to the darkness of one man's mind. In May 2020, the families of the 4 victims filed a civil lawsuit against Antonio and Sandra, Cosmo's parents. They claimed that the DiNardos shared responsibility for the tragedy. According to the families, Antonio and Sandra had long been aware of Cosmo's violent tendencies and his severe mental health issues. Yet they failed to take appropriate preventive measures. Not only did they not intervene, but they also continued to enable his behavior, allowing him access to vehicles, weapons, and the family farm where the murders occurred. The family's lawyers argued that Cosmo could never have committed such horrific acts without his parents' negligence. They accused Antonio and Sandra of turning a blind eye to their son's instability, despite repeated red flags and prior incidents that clearly showed he was dangerous. They also emphasized that Cosmo used his mother's gun and the farm machinery belonging to his father to carry out and conceal the crimes. In response, Antonio and Sandra's defense attorneys insisted that while the case was undeniably tragic, they could not be held legally responsible for their adult son's independent actions. They argued that Cosmo was 20 years old at the time, an adult capable of making his own choices, and that his mental illness did not absolve him of accountability. After months of hearings, both sides eventually reached a confidential settlement. The details of the agreement were never publicly disclosed, but the victims' families expressed that their lawsuit was never about the money. It was about justice and accountability. They wanted to ensure no other parents ignored warning signs the way the DiNardos had. The Cosmo DiNardo case remains one of the darkest chapters in Pennsylvania's history, an unimaginable story of privilege, untreated mental illness, and parental denial, culminating in 4 innocent young lives lost. Her et al. Reagan was responsible, careful, and always kept in touch with her loved ones, especially her parents. Her friends and family immediately felt that something was very wrong. By noon the next day, after countless unanswered calls and messages, her father Toby reported her missing to the police. Authorities began their search right away. They started with the restaurant where Reagan had last been seen. Her co-workers confirmed she had left alone just before 10 p.m., walking to her car as usual. Surveillance footage from a nearby building showed her heading in that direction. But strangely, her car never left the parking spot that night. When police examined the area, they found her vehicle still parked behind the restaurant. The driver's door was unlocked. Her purse and ID were on the front seat, and her keys were missing. It looked as if she had never even made it inside. Within hours, investigators organized search teams, while Reagan's family and college friends began spreading flyers and posting on social media. The story gained immediate attention, with hundreds of volunteers joining the search across Grove City and nearby areas. The police also interviewed her ex-boyfriend Jake, who was fully cooperative. He told detectives he hadn't seen Reagan that day and had been home studying all evening. His alibi was quickly confirmed by his roommates. As investigators pieced together Reagan's final movements, they discovered that around 10:15 p.m., just minutes after she left work, residents living near the parking lot reported hearing a short scream, followed by the sound of a car door slamming. But because the noise lasted only a few seconds, no one thought much of it at the time. Detectives expanded their search to surrounding woodlands, fields, and roadside ditches. Then, after 2 agonizing days, the worst fears came true. On February 10th, a jogger discovered a body in a wooded area near Scioto Grove Metro Park, just 6 miles from where Reagan had last been seen. When police arrived, they confirmed the body was that of 21-year-old Reagan Tokes. She had been shot twice, and evidence at the scene indicated she had also been assaulted. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Ohio State community and the entire state. Students who once felt safe walking around the city suddenly feared for their lives. Investigators quickly launched a full-scale homicide inquiry. Surveillance footage from traffic cameras and nearby businesses soon helped them identify a suspicious vehicle that had been seen following Reagan's car the night she disappeared. Dark gray sedan registered to a man named Brian Goldsby. A 29-year-old recently released convict had already been on edge. In the weeks leading up to Reagan's disappearance, there had been a troubling series of incidents around Grove City, reports of carjackings, robberies, and women being followed late at night. Locals were frightened, and rumors of a possible predator targeting young women began spreading across social media. So when the horrifying news broke that Reagan Toke's body had been discovered, the entire community was overcome with shock and fear. Her family was devastated beyond words. Her mother, Lisa, said it felt like the world had suddenly stopped. Her sister Mackenzie learned of Reagan's death in the worst possible way through an Instagram post. The heartbreak was indescribable. Investigators were now under immense pressure to find whoever was responsible. Early clues suggested Reagan had been abducted soon after leaving work. Detectives combed through hours of surveillance footage from the streets near Bodega Bar and discovered something critical: a gray 1991 Honda Accord following Reagan's car shortly after she got in, using traffic camera data. Police tracked the vehicle's route across several intersections, eventually tracing it to a man named Brian Goldsby, a 29-year-old recently released from prison. Further investigation revealed that Goldsby had been released just 2 months earlier after serving 6 years for armed robbery and kidnapping. Since his release, he had been living in a halfway house located only a few miles from Ohio State University. Even more disturbing, residents of the halfway house later told police they had reported Goldsby for breaking curfew and acting suspiciously on several occasions, but nothing had been done. When officers located Goldsby, they noticed scratches on his face and hands. He initially denied any involvement in Reagan's death, but his story quickly fell apart. Detectives obtained a search warrant for his residence, where they found items belonging to Reagan, including her car keys, purse, and some of her clothing. DNA analysis confirmed a match between Goldsby and samples collected from Reagan's body. Confronted with the evidence, Goldsby finally confessed. He told investigators he had followed Reagan after she left work, forced her at gunpoint into her car, and made her withdraw money from an ATM. He then drove her to Scioto Grove Metro Park, where he assaulted and shot her before fleeing the scene. He later abandoned her car in another part of town and returned on foot to the halfway house. The news of Goldsby's confession sent waves of anger throughout the state. Many questioned how someone with such a violent criminal history had been allowed to walk free without stricter supervision. Lawmakers and citizens demanded reforms to the parole and monitoring systems that had failed to protect Reagan and countless others. In March 2018, Brian Goldsby was found guilty on all counts, including aggravated murder, rape, kidnapping, and robbery. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Reagan's family sat through every day of the trial, holding hands, determined to see justice served for their daughter in the wake of her death. The Reagan-Tokes Act was introduced and later signed into law in Ohio. The legislation aimed to tighten monitoring of violent offenders after their release, ensuring that no one as dangerous as Goldsby would ever slip through the system again. Though nothing could bring Reagan back, her legacy became a catalyst for change, transforming unimaginable tragedy into a movement that would protect future generations of young women, begun when he was barely a teenager. And over the years, they had only grown more disturbing and violent. According to official records from the Ohio Department of Youth Services, Brian Lee Goldsby had committed multiple sexual assaults as a juvenile, targeting both boys and girls as young as 5 and 6 years old. His psychological assessments described him as manipulative, impulsive, and highly dangerous, someone with deep-seated violent tendencies who showed little empathy or remorse as he grew older. Goldsby's crimes escalated from sexual assaults to armed robberies and kidnappings. By his early 20s, he had already served several years behind bars for abducting a woman at gunpoint and forcing her into her car. Despite his long criminal record and a well-documented pattern of violent behavior, Goldsby was released from prison in late 2016 and placed in a halfway house located just a few miles from Ohio State University, the same city where Reagan Tokes studied and worked. What shocked investigators even more was how poorly he had been supervised after his release. Goldsby was supposed to be monitored with an ankle bracelet that tracked his movements through GPS, But when detectives checked the data from the week of Reagan's murder, they found that he had been wandering through several neighborhoods at night, often near the locations of the recent robberies that had terrified Columbus residents. It became clear that the same man who had been attacking women around German Village was the one responsible for Reagan's death. The connection was undeniable. His DNA matched samples found in Reagan's car, and the ATM footage placed him with her at the exact times withdrawals were made. When police finally arrested Goolsby, he initially denied any involvement, claiming he had found Reagan's belongings on the street. But faced with overwhelming evidence, the DNA match, GPS data, and witness statements, he eventually confessed. He admitted that on the night of February 8th, he had followed Reagan as she walked to her car after work, armed with a handgun. He forced her into the driver's seat and made her withdraw money from an ATM before driving her to Scioto Grove Metro Park, where he assaulted and then executed her. His motive, prosecutors later revealed, was as senseless as it was cruel. He claimed he needed money and simply didn't want to leave witnesses. The public outrage that followed was immense. People demanded to know how a man with Goolsby's background, a violent repeat offender and registered sex predator, had been allowed to roam free with minimal supervision. Lawmakers called for a full review of Ohio's parole system, labeling it a catastrophic failure. During the trial, the prosecution detailed every horrifying moment of Reagan's final hours, while her family sat in the courtroom reliving their worst nightmare. The jury took less than a day to find Brian Goolsby guilty of aggravated murder, rape, kidnapping, and robbery. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection in 2018, in the wake of the tragedy. The Ohio legislature introduced the Reagan-Tokes Act, a sweeping reform designed to tighten control and monitoring over violent offenders released on parole. The law ensured stricter tracking, better accountability for halfway houses, and longer review periods for high-risk convicts. Though nothing could undo what had happened to Reagan, her legacy became one of change and protection. Her name now stands as both a warning and a promise that no young woman should ever have to face the same fate again. At 9:45 p.m., Reagan left Bodega and walked toward her car parked nearby. From that moment, investigators believed Brian Goolsby had begun following her. When Reagan reached her car, he forced his way inside, threatening her at gunpoint. Terrified and confused, she complied as he ordered her to drive to several ATMs across the city. Each time, she attempted to withdraw money, but most of the transactions failed. Only one went through a withdrawal of $60. Police determined that Goolsby kept Reagan in her car for nearly an hour, making her drive from one location to another while he plotted his next move. Eventually, he directed her toward Scioto Grove Metro Park, an isolated area south of Columbus. By this point, Reagan's phone had stopped transmitting data, meaning she was either forced to turn it off or it had been destroyed. Once at the park, Goolsby made Reagan step out of the vehicle. She pleaded for her life, repeating again and again, "All I want to do is live." Her words, later recounted by Goolsby himself, would haunt everyone who heard them. Instead of sparing her, he made her undress and ordered her to walk into a nearby field. Then, without hesitation, he pulled the trigger once into the back of her head, and again into the side of her face. Afterward, he drove off in her car, abandoning it a few miles away. He tried to burn it, using gasoline and cigarettes to destroy any evidence, but the fire never caught. Inside the vehicle, investigators would later find Reagan's belongings: the gas can, cigarette butts, and key forensic evidence that linked Goolsby directly to the crime. Reagan's parents were informed of the arrest shortly after. Her mother, Lisa, said that, while it brought some sense of closure, the pain was indescribable. "She was our light," she told local news reporters through tears. "To know what she went through that night, no parent should ever have to imagine that." During the trial, the prosecution presented an overwhelming amount of evidence: DNA, surveillance footage, ATM records, and Goolsby's own recorded jailhouse confession left no room for doubt. They described the crime as a cold-blooded execution fueled by greed and pure evil. The defense tried to argue that Goolsby had been under pressure from a fictitious man named TJ, but the judge dismissed the claim as fabricated. No trace of such a person was ever found, and every aspect of the crime pointed to Goolsby acting alone. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: aggravated murder, rape, kidnapping, and aggravated robbery. During sentencing, the courtroom was silent as Reagan's father spoke. "You took away a daughter who had everything ahead of her, her dreams, her kindness, her light, but you will never take away who she was. Her spirit will outshine you for eternity." Goolsby was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, hundreds gathered holding candles and wearing pins that read "Live like Reagan." Jake, her ex-boyfriend, helped establish the Reagan Tokes Memorial Scholarship, dedicated to supporting young women pursuing degrees in psychology and social work. The tragedy also led to major legal reforms in Ohio, including Reagan's Law, aimed at improving GPS monitoring for higher-risk offenders and ensuring closer supervision of parolees. Lawmakers vowed that no family should ever have to endure such a loss due to systemic negligence again. Though justice had been served, the community of Columbus would never forget the young woman whose life was taken so senselessly, a student, a friend, a daughter, whose story changed the laws of her state and the hearts of everyone who heard it. As Reagan was finishing her shift that night, Brian Goolsby ambushed her and forced her into her own car. Holding her at gunpoint, he demanded that she drive to a nearby ATM and withdraw cash. At 10:10 p.m., Reagan pulled up to a Chase Bank, where she tried to take out $500, but the transaction was declined. 10 minutes later, security footage placed them at a Huntington Bank ATM near Huntington Park, where she made another unsuccessful attempt. Between 10:18 p.m. and 10:30 p.m., Goolsby ordered Reagan to park in a dark alley. There, he brutally raped her, a horrific act that prosecutors would later describe as deliberate and sadistic. Afterward, he forced her to drive back to the first ATM and withdraw $60, the only successful transaction of the night. By 11:12 p.m., surveillance cameras captured Reagan's car at a gas station, with both of them still inside. They remained there until roughly 11:41 p.m. before leaving the area and heading south, sometime between midnight and 1 a.m. Goolsby directed Reagan toward the isolated Scioto Grove Metro Park. In that dark and empty space, he forced her to remove her clothes and walk into a field as she begged for her life, repeating, "Please, I just want to live." He raised the gun and shot her twice in the head. After killing her, Goolsby took her car and fled the scene. He drove to his girlfriend's home, arriving around 1:45 a.m., and even went to McDonald's with her shortly after, likely to establish an alibi. Later, he discarded the gun and shell casings in a sewer and attempted to burn the car using gasoline and cigarettes, though the fire never caught. In a final, chilling act, he gave his girlfriend Reagan's purse and wallet, claiming they were an early Valentine's Day gift. A week later, as the investigation continued, friends and family gathered to say their final goodbyes. The church was overflowing, not only with those who had known Reagan personally, but also with strangers from across Ohio who had been moved by her story. The funeral was described as a celebration of her life, focusing on her warmth, intelligence, and kindness rather than the horrific way it had ended. From the service in Maumee to the graveside in Perrysburg, the community came together in shared grief. One message left in an online memorial read, "Although I never met her, my heart aches for her family. This story has touched me deeply. I can't stop thinking about Reagan." On February 15th, Inside the church she had attended since childhood, Reagan was laid to rest. Her father, Toby Tokes, said later that seeing her killer in court filled him with uncontrollable rage and disbelief. "I was shaking," he said. "I'm surprised I didn't have a heart attack that day. They had a monster in custody once before, and they let him go." When Brian Goolsby first appeared in court, he pleaded not guilty, despite overwhelming evidence, his prior confessions, and the DNA linking him to every aspect of the crime. Preparations for his trial began immediately. 3 months after her death, Ohio State University's graduation ceremony took place, the day Reagan had worked toward for years. During the event, a moment of silence was held, and her name was read aloud. Her parents walked across the stage to accept her diploma posthumously, receiving a standing ovation from thousands. The family's statement read, "Reagan wanted to be a Buckeye ever since she was a little girl. Today, her dream came true. We are endlessly proud of her. The gift of education comes with discipline, dedication, and determination, and Reagan had all of that and more. We ask that others use this gift to make a difference in the world, just as she would have done." In March 2018, Goolsby's trial began. Before entering the courtroom, jurors were taken on a jury view, a guided visit to each of the key locations from that night. They stood where Reagan was forced to withdraw money, the alley where she was assaulted, and finally the field at Scioto Grove Metro Park, where her life was taken. A tarp covered the memorial left there by mourners to shield it from public view during the proceedings. Back in the courtroom, witnesses were called. Police officers who had first discovered the body gave emotional testimony. Reagan's roommates took the stand next, describing the night she went missing, how panic spread through the apartment, and how they called police when her phone went silent. County Prosecutor Ron O'Brien expressed deep disappointment, stating that he firmly believed the death penalty was the only just outcome. Unwilling to let the matter rest, he continued to pursue what he considered a fair and rightful sentence. In 2018, he filed a 53-page motion seeking a cross-appeal. His arguments centered on the jury instructions given by the trial judge, specifically that jurors had been told to consider mitigating factors presented by the defense, even though no such mitigating evidence had actually been submitted. "I think once the jury incorrectly hears that," Ron explained, "it affects their decision. The state has shown that the process was impaired, and that there was prejudice during the penalty phase." He pointed out that inconsistencies in Brian's statements, his shifting stories, and fabricated details had been treated too leniently, allowing jurors to weigh elements that should never have influenced their deliberations. Finally, in April 2019, Ohio's 10th District Court of Appeals granted the state permission to move forward with the appeal. However, to Ron's frustration, the court ultimately ruled that the trial judge's instructions had been proper and did not warrant any change. Still determined, Ron filed another appeal, but the Ohio Supreme Court dismissed it entirely. Despite the setback, he tried to remain optimistic, saying, "The fight for justice doesn't always end the way we hope, but it doesn't mean we stop fighting." The good news, they said, was that he would die in prison after the full truth came out and the system's failures were exposed. Reagan's family made a vow, a promise, to fight for change. "The system is flawed," they said, "and changes need to happen, and will happen, because of this senseless tragedy. We will dedicate our lives to making sure of it." And that's exactly what they did in 2018. They reached a settlement with the company responsible for housing and supervising Brian Goolsby. A year later, in 2019, the Reagan-Tokes Law officially came into effect, upheld as constitutional by the Ohio State Supreme Court. The tragedy of what happened to Reagan, and the systemic failures that allowed it, forced Ohio to finally confront its broken oversight. The new law allows courts to impose indefinite sentences, with both minimum and maximum. terms for first and second degree felonies when life imprisonment isn't possible. While in prison, Brian committed 52 separate violations and was transferred between 5 facilities. Yet under old Ohio law, none of it could extend his sentence. In fact, he was released 6 months early. The Reagan-Tokes Act changed that. Now, the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction has the authority to extend an inmate's incarceration up to the maximum sentence if they commit crimes or break rules behind bars. It also brought new standards for monitoring released offenders, including reforms to the use of ankle monitors. From Jake's fundraiser and countless donations, the Reagan Delaney Tokes Memorial Foundation Scholarship was created, offering tuition and housing each year for 2 Ohio State University students. Self-defense classes were also launched in her honor, empowering others, just as Reagan would have wanted. A memorial was built at Scioto Grove Metro Park, known as the Tranquility Garden, a place of peace and remembrance. I used to feel a crushing pain when we'd pull in here, her mother, Lisa, said softly. Now I don't feel that anymore. The pain never goes away. We carry it every day, but we keep moving forward. There's still a beautiful world out there, and we have to learn to live in it, carrying her in our hearts, always. The garden is filled with details that reflect who Reagan was, a peaceful water feature symbolizing her astrological sign, her favorite color blue scattered throughout, and wildlife she loved. 5 buckeye trees stand proudly as a tribute to her beloved Ohio State University, her happiest place on earth. Her ex-boyfriend, Jake, has rarely spoken publicly since her death, but when he did, he recalled their very first date, a story that perfectly captures Reagan's spirit. We went apple picking, and she spotted this perfect apple at the top of a tree, Jake said. Neither of us could reach it. So, I lifted her onto my shoulders. When she finally got it, she didn't keep it. She shoved it in my mouth and made me take a big bite. Later, she told me she wanted to find the biggest, reddest apple just to give it to me. That's who she was, always thinking of others before herself. He paused before adding, from the moment I met her until the last time I spoke to her, she made me a better person. I'll always love her. She was my best friend, and she always will be. The final hours of Reagan's life were unimaginably terrifying, standing alone in a dark, freezing field, pleading for mercy. Yet through it all, her memory remains one of light, compassion, and love. Everyone who knew her spoke the same words: kind, gentle, selfless, and full of promise. Her mother, Lisa, said it best: love will always overcome everything. As the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper. Thank you for joining me here on Crime Whisper. True crime stories remind us not only of life's darkest mysteries, but also of the importance of awareness, resilience, and hope. So as you drift into sleep, let the rain soothe your thoughts and carry you into peace. Until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.